Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see you this evening. So you may notice there's been a slight change in programming. You may be expecting to be studying 2 Timothy chapter 3 tonight because chronologically it would come after chapter 2. However, I have previous interrupting commitments that have come up for next week. And so I have graciously been allowed to switch weeks. So you'll get chapter 3 next week. We'll do chapter 4 this week. So going into this, just a couple of reminders real quick about our themes that we are working on through 1st and 2nd Timothy. I've condensed them down a little bit just to save some space and kind of reword them a little bit. But remember that we're focusing on the two things in Timothy about building a sincere faith and then trying to not only understand how it applied to Timothy, but our own dedication to the things which promote stewardship to God. And so to achieve those themes, or to bring them into our class tonight, there are 3 objectives for chapter 4 that we will go through. So we're going to break the actual chapter into 3 sections, and each section will correlate to one of these objectives that you will see up here. So we, number 1, want to look at the traits that Paul ascribes that Timothy have as he prepares to preach the word. We want to understand how Paul uses the culture of the first century to relate his message and make it understandable for the modern audience at the time. And then we're going to do a little case study on 2 people, Demas and Mark, and look at how their changing narratives in their spiritual walks was discussed and how that application applies to us. So the first 2 objectives will actually fall into more of the second theme, dedication on things which promote stewardship to God. So we want to kind of get some application of that for our own spiritual walks. And then we will do some correlations on faith building with our third objective. All right, so let's get into this. The first section is going to be verses 1 through 5. So let's read that real quickly together. So 2 Timothy chapter 4, starting in verse 1. I solemnly charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing in his kingdom, preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Reprove, rebuke, exhort, and with great patience and instruction. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance to their own desires, and will turn away their ears from the truth, and will turn aside to myths. But you, be sober in all things, endure hardship, do the work of an evangelist, and fulfill your ministry. So the first thing let's do is let's kind of pick this apart a little bit and do a little a word analysis and try to pick out specifically what things are identified here for Timothy to try to embody and emulate as a preacher, and I would argue in the bigger picture as a disciple of Paul and of Jesus. So I'm giving you a cheat here. I'm picking verses 2 and 5. These are where the traits are listed. So you kind of have to look at the beginning and the end of this section. And this is kind of the get you warmed up to participate in discussion part of the class. So this is kind of just a quick shout it out. Let's hit these points. So I'm looking for general participation. What are these traits that Paul describes for Timothy here in verses 2 and 5? Okay. Willingness to speak the truth regardless of popularity, Daniel says. Okay. Preparedness. Endurance. Okay. Say that again one more time. Okay, so there we go. That's the first one we're looking for. So correct, that was the first thing in the list. Some of these we've already hit already. What does he list after correct? Okay, endures coming. There we go. Thank you. Rebuke is next. So we have reprove or correct, and then rebuke, and then exhort. There we go. Thank you. I've been a teacher. I have good wait time. Patience, thank you. And the last one in verse 2. Okay, teach or instruct. And then the other half of the list is found in verse 5. So the first one is, there's one before that. Be sober, that's one. Be sober. The second one is endure hardship. And then we have two more. Okay, do the work, which would be evangelize and fulfill the ministry, kind of all wrapped into one. So there are 9 individual itemized practices that Paul describes that Timothy should have as he is preaching the word, but the bigger picture again would be discipleship. So as we think about the text in 2 Timothy, how does it apply to our spiritual walk, our role as disciples in 2024? It's probably important that we try to also embody these same 9 traits. So we've had a conversation on the men's group text this year about the importance of memorizing Scripture and committing it to memory so that you can recall these things in times when you may be faced with trials, temptations, and things that may directly have connection to this list of 9 things here. But this is a list of 9, and this is not necessarily the easiest list of words. These are not necessarily common words that we would use. So there are ways that maybe we can use our brains and our understanding of other things to help influence remembering a list like this. So I'm going to give you one of those tips. Again, I'm bringing in my past teacher experience here to the role. So we're going to do a quick aside, and this is going to seem like a random question, but I promise you there's a point. So how many of you remember, by show of hands, this commercial or series of commercials? Yep. So where's the beef? This is a commercial for what fast food restaurant chain? Wendy's. Okay, so a lot of people are like, yep. So not seeing necessarily a lot of hands. I see a lot of yep. Okay, so you may be asking, what's the point instead of where's the beef? So this is a thing that most of us are familiar with. We've seen it. They actually redid it in a Super Bowl commercial either this year or last year. I can't remember which year. But it's a thing that most of us are familiar with. So what I would do is I would say if you can connect things to stuff that's already lodged into your brain, you know the where's the beef thing, you probably are now replaying the commercial in your mind. You can connect that and use that to help you build a set of a list like this. So rather than giving you the list the way it's written here, if we just rearrange the words a little bit and then mnemonic device this, instead of where's the beef, we can talk about the price of beef, right? So some people do the whole what does that have to do with the price of tea in China thing? This is similar to that. So if you can remember that the price of beef is the acronym we're looking for, then hopefully that will help you with the practice of trying to commit this to memory. So patience, rebuke, instruct, correct, exhort, be sober, endure hardship, evangelize, fulfill the ministry. This list of 9 things becomes much more digestible if we turn it into something that's a little more akin to something that's stuck in our brain that we can't get out no matter how hard we try. So just a little tip, a little trick that I wanted to share with you as we think about this pursuit of memorizing Scripture and trying to commit these traits that, again, are very important as Timothy was instructed to have them, that we also emulate and embody these things. Okay, so what I want to do real quick, since we've kind of hit the outsides of the Scripture, is do just a real quick discussion on verses 3 and 4, because we kind of skipped over those 2 verses. So just to reiterate kind of a quick synopsis of 3 and 4, Paul is saying that eventually there's going to be some that decide that they're tired of listening to truth and they're not wanting sound doctrine, and so the phrase is they'll want to have their ears tickled. They will choose teachers of their own desire and turn to those teachers instead. So I will ask you quickly for a few comments on, there we go. What is the application for us? Obviously, this is written to a first century audience when a lot of the preaching and teaching and things are new to them. We have the Bible. It's in written form. we can read it repeatedly. What is the application of what Paul's saying here to Timothy for us? Okay, teaching the truth is the main point from Dan there. Teaching the truth, teaching the word. Other thoughts? Right?
Just be aware that Satan will attack the church and he will introduce false doctrine into the minds and hearts of the children of God and have you fall away. And so already we're seeing that in a number of churches across this land, such as homosexuality is now approved in so many mainstream denominational churches.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Other thoughts? Yeah, go ahead, Ian.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a warning here. It's kind of stating what will happen in the future to other people, but I think it's also a warning to yourself or to the Christians during this time, is that you can't let your own passions interfere with the truth. You can't let your own passions and desires skew the truth. You have to be open to hearing and receiving the truth for what it is and not try and adapt it, right, to fit your lifestyle or your desires.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Anybody else? Yes, Tosin.
Well, when I look at this verse 3 and 4, it reminds me of the parable of the sower in Matthew. So when Jesus speaks the word to them, and some of them fell, on the rocky soil, and the cares of this life take it away. Some fell along the wayside. It's just kind of close to this, and we can always apply that into our lives. So we hear the gospel. So just like Brian said, we got to be careful with what we listen from false teachers so we don't fall away. Especially what Christ says in the book of Peter. Peter here said that his judgment will start in the church. So we have to hold the faith and cleave to Christ.
All right, thank you, Tosin. And you and I are obviously on the same wavelength because the sower is going to come back into my conversation later on. So we must be thinking somewhat similar on that. So thank you for that comment. Okay, let's look at the next section, which is verses 6 through 8. So another shorter chunk of chapter 4 here. So let's read the text directly, starting in verse 6. Paul says, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. In the future there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing." Okay, so what I'm going to do is read this again, and I would encourage you to view the version on the board if you can see it, because there are going to be a few words that get highlighted as we read through this a second time. And I want you to start thinking about these key words that are highlighted, because we're going to use this to have a further discussion on these verses. So we'll read it again. Starting in verse 6, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the course. I have kept the faith. In the future there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing." So there are 5 words that you see highlighted here. If we take those out of the text and just kind of isolate them, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes. I would like you to converse with the people that you're sitting around. And the question I want you to discuss is, what first century vocations, if you will, would the reader, specifically Timothy, but other people who may be reading this letter in the first century, what vocations, what jobs, what roles would the first century people automatically draw to mind and think of when Paul mentions some of these key words that I've pulled out here? So again, about 2 minutes, discuss it with the people sitting around you, and then we'll come back and share thoughts as a large group. All right, time's up. So somebody willing to offer any conclusions that you and your neighbors were drawn to on any particular one of these? It'd be great if you'd start at the top, but you don't have to. Terry, oh, the mic's coming, Terry.
Paul is saying, I'm poured out like a drink offering. He's about to finish he was being persecuted. He was about to finish. So he's leaving the charge up to Timothy and others like him to keep the faith, to do all of these things that he has written afore in his letter and continues to write, exhorting and, all these different charges he has laid upon him.
Okay, thank you, Terry. Right?
Is the question is what do these key words would, how these would be understood or interpreted by the Gentiles who are hearing the word for the first time? Is that what you're saying?
No, so I'm looking for, like, if a first century Christian is reading this particular section, when they hear the word offering, what vocation, what job, what role would someone have filled in a first century state that would have been associated with making offering?
Well, I guess offering would bring to mind the priest making the sacrifices.
Okay, thank you, Brian. That's what I was hoping we would get on that one. Thank you. How about fight or fought? Or fought the good fight, if you want to go the whole connotation. Okay, gladiators and or soldiers. That was a very common part of Roman life in the first century. How about finish? Finish the course. Okay, Olympics or athletes. The fourth one is probably the trickiest one. What do y'all come up with for kept? I'm curious.
We thought about like a scribe, someone who might be like a keeper of records or important documents. It's their job to keep those and maintain those. We also, HE also mentioned like a priest too, like it's their job to keep the law and make sure people are keeping to the law and behaving correctly.
Okay, thank you. I wish I had thought of the scribe thing. That's excellent. Yes, sir.
I was thinking more along the lines like a shepherd, someone who keeps after the animals and watches over them.
Okay, excellent. Like that one too. Okay, steward. This is a great exercise because all of the things that you're saying are great. They are also not what I came up with, which is not necessarily the right answer, but diversity of thought is important, right? So the one that I came up with was guardian, because guard is, especially we're talking about Paul, he's been kept under guard significant amounts of time. That would have been people who were, and we're about to read this long list of names that are coming, they'd be familiar, or very familiar with the role of a guard, because that was a large part of how Paul spent his life was under guard. And then how about crown? Okay, king, which first century translation of king would be emperor, but essentially the same thing, right? So we actually have seen this list before, or a shortened version of it previously in 2 Timothy. Anybody recall where that was? It was in chapter 2, yes. So soldier, athlete, and farmer, which is not in this list, but is another very relevant, applicable role that people would have served in the first century. So if Paul is now doing this for a second time, using these vocations that would be readily on the front of the mind of the reader, Timothy and others, the question I pose to you is why? Why use this writing style? Why use this technique?
Well, one, it paints a picture in your mind as he's using these words. You think of these things, and it's relatable, is number one, but also it's about how being a Christian is all-encompassing in your life, and it's every part of your life, and despite what you do as a profession or the type of people that you encounter from a day-to-day basis, like in every situation, Paul is showing that I've done these things that I should do as a Christian. And I think he's just trying to bring awareness to that no matter what happens, you need to stay the course.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Albert?
Appreciate the sight that he's writing a personal letter to Timothy, and he's just said, brother, my time has come. Your charge is still there. So it's a very personal letter. It's one that he's trying to encourage them. As Rick has mentioned in previous classes, there were tears the last time they parted. And so to me, personally, I don't want to lose sight of that personal aspect of this letter and who it's addressed to. And definitely we can glean for us today, but it's also just, he's talking very personal to someone he loves dearly and is saying goodbye, and it's like, we don't have time to be sad. I'm charging you to do these things.
Okay, thank you, Albert. Thank you for that. Brian? Ian's coming.
Well, I think Paul's using these worldly figures, these natural figures within this life for the same reason Jesus used parables. They illustrate spiritual truths, and it makes it easier to understand and comprehend and apply. So as these natural things of this world provide illustrations and revelations of spiritual realities, makes it easier to incorporate into their life.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Anybody else? One more, Ian. Thank you.
I think the language used is mainly to show that being a Christian is work. We have jobs to do within our rules in the church and everything that needs to be done, and they use those certain language to show that the different jobs that have to be done and all the work that he's done to help further the church.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So I tend to agree with all the things that were said. The thing that I thought about too, along with Brian, I thought about the parables. Paul talks about, he says, emulate me as I emulate Christ, and Christ did a lot of his teaching using parables. So I'm sure that Paul is drawing from that previous knowledge of Jesus' teaching and trying to use that in his own message. So I think this is something that we need to keep about ourselves, think about as we have conversations with people who may not be as familiar with the word as we are. I've tried to model this for you a little bit with something that we already done in class tonight. Like, I'm using something that's relevant, something that you know of, something that would have had absolutely zero application to first century church, but it hopefully was something to at least draw your attention. Like, I guarantee you nobody expected, except Daniel because he saw it, nobody expected to get the Where's the Beef commercial in Bible study tonight, right? So, but it's something you're familiar with. It's something that pretty much everybody knows, and if you can use it to help you retain and remember some biblical principles. And I also agree with Ian's comment about it's about being relatable too, right? That's something that we need, again, to keep in mind as we have conversations with people who may not have the level or depth of understanding that we have, is that we've got to be relatable with what we're doing. We've got to understand how people receive what we say. And one of the things that I wanted to do tonight in this class is to give you a different way of thinking about some things, because obviously the actual text and the meat and the what is written is important, but I think there's also another level that we can get into with our Bible study and looking at how what is written was written. Because that can, again, it can play into how we converse with other people and potentially how we study on our own time. So just something else for you to think about on a little different track. So to keep us on schedule, let's move to section 3, which is going to be the last section of the chapter, which is most of the verses, but this is a pretty lengthy list of, it's kind of a who's who, as, again, this is Paul winding down his epistles. He's going through and kind of giving a very concise list of people here. So let's read through the verses first, and then we're actually going to focus on 3 specific people from this list. And I'm just picking 3 because these are the 3 that I feel like we have a good can't have a good conversation and good discussion about. You could pick 3 that were not the 3 that I pick and do the same thing. But that's my prerogative as class teacher. So that's what we're going to do. So let's read starting in verse 9. Make every effort to come to me soon, for Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for service. But Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus, and when you come, bring the cloak which I left at Troas with Carpus, and the books, especially the parchments. Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Be on guard against him yourself, for he vigorously opposed our teaching. At my first offense, no one supported me, but all deserted me. May it not be counted against them. But the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, so that through me the proclamation might be fully accomplished, and that all the Gentiles might hear. And I was rescued out of the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil deed, and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. Greet Prisca and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Erastus remained at Corinth, but Trophimus I left sick at Miletus. Make every effort to come before winter. Eubulus greets you, also Pudens and Linus and Claudia and all the brethren. The Lord be with your spirit. Grace be with you. Okay, so the first individual that I would like to do a little quick look at, and we're just going to do this one quickly, is Alexander the coppersmith, because he spends a couple of verses talking about this run-in he had with Alexander the coppersmith. Where has Paul had a run-in with another metallurgist and his group? Okay, the Silversmith Guild. Anybody remember the dude's name? Demetrius is correct. And that is in Acts chapter 19. For those of you that are thinking, that was in Acts somewhere, you're correct. It is Acts chapter 19, verses 23 through 31. We're not going to read through that again for the sake of time, but you can go back and look that up here in a little bit. But Demetrius the silversmith is correct. So he's had a pretty serious encounter there in Ephesus, is where this Demetrius run-in occurred. And he's now having issues with, or had issues with, a second metallurgist, this time a coppersmith. So just for a real quick discussion, maybe just a couple of comments, why does Paul seem to have such intense interactions with people in this particular profession? Because this seems to be a common thing, but it's not coincidental that it's mentioned more than once that he's had a serious run-in with these people that do metalwork. Okay, they created idols. That was probably the primary function of the metalworking. So why would that have created such an intense interaction with Paul? What's that? Okay, it's a financial problem, right? Demetrius basically says as much in Acts chapter 19. Essentially, the two quotes from chapter 19 are that the silversmiths brought no little business to the craftsmen, and then Demetrius himself says, our prosperity depends on this business. So Paul is upsetting a huge faction of the artisans in the first century because their livelihood depends on this polytheistic pagan culture that they live in. What I want to maybe just draw out from this is that despite the fact that he went through it once, he wasn't afraid to go toe-to-toe with these people a second time. Despite the fact that they're very passionately going to fight with him because their livelihood is on the line, wasn't a reason for Paul to back away from that confrontation from these people and stick to what he knew to be the truth and convey that message with a strong conviction. So I don't want to spend any more time on Alexander because I think that is less valuable than looking at the two of the other people that are mentioned here. So we're going to look and do a little comparative analysis here to finish up today with Demas and Mark. So there's a few things that we know about these two individuals pertaining to their start, their journey and then where they are at the end of Paul's life as he finishes this 2 Timothy epistle. So we can go all the way back to 48 AD or Acts chapter 12. This is actually where we get our first Paul and Mark interaction. So we're talking about John Mark, which is also believed to be the author of the Gospel of Mark. Paul and Barnabas took Mark or John Mark along with them on their first missionary journey. So he was a fairly significant companion to those two as they went and did their first tour of the Mediterranean and started spreading the word to the Gentile nation. We aren't sure of Demas' status at that point. We're probably pretty safely going to be convinced that he was just a Gentile doing his Gentile thing at that point, because the indicator based on the text here and other places is that he's from Thessalonica, which Paul did not visit right at the beginning of his missionary journeys. So that came in the second missionary journey. So we're not really sure the origins of Demas at that point. But we do know that Mark, his history with Paul goes all the way back to 48 AD or the beginning of Paul's missionary journeys. We don't have to fast forward very far, mainly just a year in the case of Mark, to see that he's already given up. Paul labels him as a deserter. You may remember that in Acts chapter 15, Paul and Barnabas actually get into a pretty serious debate over whether or not they should take Mark with them on their second missionary journey. It becomes such a significant issue that the two of them part company over it, and Barnabas goes his way and takes Mark, and Paul goes his way and takes Silas with him. So it's a significant enough desertion during the first missionary journey that Mark did that Paul was not willing to kind of bring him back into the fold and give him a second chance as he starts his second journey. And then somewhere along in that line is again where Paul gets to Thessalonica, which is where we believe Demas is from. And naturally, putting the pieces together, we can infer that he was converted somewhere in that second missionary journey and became a convert and a worker for the Lord. And then we get to, we have to jump a significant amount of time this time. So the first jump was not very long. It took only a year or two for Mark to desert Paul and Barnabas. We have to jump ahead basically 15 to 13 years to the end of 2 Timothy. Paul is in prison in Rome. His life is about to end. And Paul says here in verse 10, that Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. So despite his start as a significant contributor, and we know that he was a significant contributor because he's actually mentioned in 2 other epistles as being a fellow worker in spreading of the gospel. For your reference, those are the end of Colossians and Philemon, which were written about the same time in Paul's first Roman imprisonment. So we know that initially Demas is really on fire and he's really doing a lot of good things. Paul mentions him twice in a very positive context. And then we get to here at the end in 2 Timothy, and now Paul's calling him a deserter. And essentially the root of what the word deserter here in this context is that he basically left him for dead. Just decided that, look, I know Paul's in a bad state, but I can't, I'm not doing it anymore, and I'm out. If we read to verse 11, though, Paul tells Timothy to bring Mark with you, for he is useful to me for service. So, and this is the same Mark who was the original deserter in the first missionary journey. Now we get all the way to AD 65, and Paul says, Mark is valuable. He is a servant to me. He is valuable for service. So he has a somewhat significant role now. So somewhere along the line, Mark has turned back to the truth and come back to a correct position of spiritual standing. So the question that I want to ask you here is, what can we glean from looking at these 2 different timelines and spiritual journeys for Demas and Mark? What's the application for us if we look at how their lives changed, how one started off really good. By the time we get to the end, he's gone. The other one started out okay, fell away, but now is really a force again at the end. What can we glean from looking at these two timelines, these two life stories? Okay, I see Brian. I don't see anybody else yet. So Brian, you get to go first.
Somebody else. Well, I think of Jesus talking about who is the faithful one, who's the righteous one, the son who says he will, then he doesn't, or the one who says he won't and he does. Clearly, it's an indication here of, at least in my mind, the redemption of the sinner who has rebelled against God, knows that he can return to the Father and to Jesus and have his sins forgiven and be a worker for the Lord.
Okay, thank you for bringing that up, Brian. I actually was prepared for that reference. That actually comes from Matthew chapter 21, verses 28 through 31. That's the parable where Jesus tells of the two sons, where the father says to the sons, go work, and the one says, nah, I ain't doing that, and then he changes his mind and does it anyway. And the first one who says, okay, sure, I'll do it, and then he doesn't go and do it. And so that is from Matthew chapter 21. So I also saw a parallel with that. Tosin.
So I think of the 5 wise virgins, and they keep their lamp burning, and the other unwise virgin that they didn't keep their lamp burning until Christ came, and like the bridegroom came, and one of them missed it, the other one did not. Then I think of another scripture in the Bible that says like we should focus onto Jesus Christ, the author and the finisher of our faith. So whosoever lay hands on the plow and look back is not fit for his kingdom. So Demas was not in that category. So he fall away from the faith and he lay his hands on the plow, but he looked back and is not fit for the kingdom. So while Mark focused on Jesus, he lays hands on the plow and he kept going, no matter the difficulties or challenges that he went through.
Okay, thank you, sir. Albert, did you have a comment?
That our trials and tribulations we go through in life, our preparedness for those are going to help us either grow stronger, or we're not going to be prepared for this world and time and chance in the trials and tribulations, and it's going to cause fear, and we're going to run away from the truth that we had in our heart. So our preparedness for life, trials, tribulation, time and chance, how we're prepared for that would, I think, possibly be why one went one way and one went the other.
Okay, thank you, Albert. So I'm actually going to loop back in. I'll let you go, Daniel, if you can be quick. Okay, never mind. Don't give in the mic. Go ahead.
It just sobers me to think about Demas. There's a little bit of speculation, but it could be the case that he always loved this present world, even through the times that he was working. And to me, it makes me ask my question, have I really had a transformation of my heart to where I really don't love the world anymore? And I love, as Tosin said, I love Jesus and I love his kingdom. And I've given up even a love of the world, because I think it could be the case that Demas was just kind of forcing himself to work and do what he knew was right, but his heart was never really fully transformed, and eventually he just lost stamina, perhaps, and it was just too hard to resist the love of the world, and he went back.
Yeah, thank you. So my last thought on this, and actually that's where Tosin and I were on the same wavelength. The parable of the sower is what I thought about with this. So from Matthew chapter 13, we have two basically textbook examples of two of the places that the sower scattered the seed. We have the rocky places, which is the person who hears the word, receives it with joy, but he has no root, and affliction or persecution come and take that away. That was where John Mark started, right? He started out really on fire, let's go. As soon as they went on that first missionary journey, they got a little resistance, and he was like, nope, I'm out. Eventually, he came back. Eventually, he became good soil, where the root took hold and grew into something big. Demas, on the other hand, is the seed that falls among the thorns. So he hears the word, it gets implanted, but the worries of the world and wealth make him unfruitful and choke out the word. So he became one of those, like, it got there, but the other things around him, which maybe to Daniel's point, maybe were always there on a constant nag, and then once Paul is in this really like end of life situation, he sees the end coming. Demas says, I'm out. Like, I just can't, I'm not willing to commit it to that level. And so that's it for me. All right, so appreciate that. Just again, hitting the objectives. We talked about Timothy and those traits. So don't forget the price of beef when you go home later. That might be your good mnemonic to remember those. Remember that culture, context matters. So be relatable when you spread the message, and think about how the stories of Mark and Demas may be applicable to your own spiritual journey. And thank you again for those who participated and for being here tonight. And we'll see you again soon.